The old man sat in the corner of the dimly lit room, his back hunched beneath the weight of his years, the soft ticking of a wall clock his only companion. He looked almost out of place, as though time had passed him by, leaving him stranded in a world that no longer cared for him. His hands, weathered and trembling, gripped the edges of the envelope that lay before him, his name written on it in a hurried, jagged scrawl. He had long since stopped worrying about the hand that had written it. Inside the house, the voices of his children rang out, loud, angry, and unrelenting. They were gathered in the kitchen, their conversations filled with frustration, sharp words, and pointed glances. It was as if they had forgotten that he could still hear them, despite his deafness. They mocked him for his frailty, laughed behind his back about his inability to understand the simplest of things. It wasn't the first time, and he knew it wouldn't be the last. They were no longer the children he had once raised with such love, guiding them through life's difficulties, sacrificing his own needs for theirs. Over the years, they had become strangers, their hearts hardened by their own ambitions, their lives no longer intertwined with his. And he had retreated into the silence that had now become his sanctuary, a way to escape their cruelty, their neglect, their lack of understanding. But as he sat there, holding the letter in his hands, he knew this silence would speak louder than anything he could have said. His fingers fumbled with the edges of the envelope as he carefully peeled it open. The crisp sound of paper tearing filled the room. Inside, there was a single sheet of paper, neatly folded, his name once again scrawled on the top. It had been written months ago, but today, it felt as though it had been written for this very moment. With a deep breath, he unfolded the paper and began to read. To my dear children, the letter began, its words a stark contrast to the tension that filled the room. If you are reading this, then I am no longer there to explain myself, nor will I be there to witness the consequences of my decision. Know this, however, my silence has been my choice, not my burden. I have watched you all grow into who you are today, and though I have been silent, I have not been blind. You have all become so focused on the things that matter least, that I fear you have forgotten what truly matters. The old man's eyes began to sting as the words sank in. This wasn't what he had expected. This wasn't the letter he had thought would reveal his final wishes. For years, I have silently endured your mockery, your neglect, your disregard for the sacrifices I made for you all. You have all mocked me, my deafness, my age, my frailty, and I have let you. Perhaps it was easier that way. But now, as I sit here, the truth is clearer than ever. You do not deserve the inheritance that I had once planned to give you. You will never understand the depth of my decision until it is too late. The money, the house, everything I worked for, it is no longer yours. It will go to someone who knows what it means to care, to sacrifice, to love without expectation. His heart pounded in his chest. This was the moment that would change everything. He could already hear their voices rising from the other room, their laughter, their casual cruelty. They had no idea. No idea what he had done. The letter continued, do not try to find the will. It will be locked away, hidden until the right time. But know this, your inheritance will not come from me. It will come from someone who understands what it means to give, to love, to honor the ties that bind us. His breath caught in his throat as he continued to read, but the words blurred before his eyes. His hands shook, not just from age, but from the gravity of what he had just read. This wasn't a will that would leave them with more money. No, this was a will that would make them face something far worse than any material possession. He folded the letter back carefully, as if the simple act of closing it would seal the fate of his children. His hands trembled with a mixture of fear and satisfaction. The truth was out, and now, there was no turning back. They would have to reckon with what he had done. The voices in the other room had grown louder, more agitated. The youngest of his children, Mark, was speaking now, his voice sharp with irritation. Can you believe him? Mark's voice rang through the house. He's just sitting there, like nothing matters. Does he even care about what happens to this place when he's gone? I told you we should have sold it years ago, his sister, Clara, added, her voice tinged with frustration. It's just a burden now. The old man's too stubborn to understand that we need to move on. This house, all of it, it's holding us back. The old man's heart sank. They hadn't changed at all. He had hoped that over the years, they might have softened, found compassion in their hearts, but no. They were the same, selfish, greedy, dismissive. He stood up slowly, the creaking of his bones echoing through the room, but as he reached the door, he paused. He knew what was coming. The confrontation was inevitable. The letter in his hand seemed to grow heavier with each passing second. He didn't know how much longer he could stand their cruelty. But this moment, would be the one that would force them to see him. To see what they had become. He walked into the kitchen, where they were gathered around the table, and the room fell silent. Mark, Clara, and the others all turned to look at him, their faces twisted in surprise. They had expected him to stay hidden, as he always did, quietly enduring their disdain. But today, something was different. He placed the letter on the table in front of them, his voice barely a whisper. "Read it," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Read it, and then you'll understand." They stared at the envelope, unsure of what to do, but after a moment, Mark snatched it up, his eyes scanning the words quickly. The others leaned in, their faces pale as they read. Their expressions shifted from curiosity to confusion, and then, as the truth began to sink in, to disbelief. What is this?" Clara whispered, her voice shaky. "This can't be real. This isn't." But the old man was already gone, retreating back into the silence he had come to know so well. The sounds of his children's voices, once filled with mockery and disdain, now sounded different. There was fear in their tone now, regret, confusion. But it was too late for them to take back the years of neglect, the years of cruelty. And as the silence settled in around the old man, he could already hear the distant echoes of their regret, the way they would soon wish they had never treated him so. The game had begun. The days following the revelation were marked by a strange, oppressive silence that hung over the house like a dark cloud. The old man, whom they had all dismissed for years, had managed to shake them with nothing more than a single letter. It was a letter that had torn away their illusion of control, exposing their greed and entitlement for the world to see. Clara had tried to reach out to him several times, but he had refused to speak. She had called him, begged him, even sent him messages through Mark, but each time, he remained as silent as ever. His silence was a statement in itself, and the message was clear: he was no longer a part of their lives. Mark, on the other hand, couldn't stand the quiet. He had been the first to seize the letter and read it, his eyes scanning each word with growing disbelief. He couldn't believe it. How could their father have done this to them? They had sacrificed so much for him. The time they had spent trying to keep him comfortable in his old age, the money they had spent on his medical bills, how could he throw it all away over something as trivial as his own pride? But it wasn't just the money that bothered him. It was the control, the power their father had suddenly reclaimed from them. And it terrified him. "That old man is playing some game with us," Mark muttered to himself as he paced the kitchen floor late that night. His voice was thick with frustration, his fists clenched. "He's always been like this, silent, stubborn. But this is something else." Clara, sitting at the table, her face buried in her hands, couldn't bring herself to look at her brother. She hadn't expected this. The letter had thrown her into a state of disbelief. She kept rereading it, hoping it would make more sense, but each time, the reality of it hit her harder. "I just don't get it, Mark," Clara said softly, her voice cracking. "Why would he do this? Why now?" Mark stopped pacing, his eyes hardening. "I don't know. But I'll tell you this much, we can't just let it go. We need to find that will. If there's one thing we learned today, it's that we're not getting anything from him willingly. But there's got to be something more to this, something we're missing. They had been sitting in silence ever since, neither knowing how to move forward. The house, which had once been filled with their bickering and loud conversations, now felt empty. Cold. The walls seemed to close in around them, a suffocating reminder that they had lost control of everything. The old man, meanwhile, was content in his solitude. It had taken years for him to reach this point, to come to terms with the reality of his children's indifference. The sacrifices he had made for them had been uncountable, but it had never been enough. They had always wanted more. And now, as he sat in his favorite chair, the one by the window where he could watch the world go by, he felt at peace. For the first time in years, he didn't have to pretend. He didn't have to smile through their cruelty or endure their pity. His silence had given him more power than he had ever realized. And as the days passed, he knew the time would come when his children would be forced to face the truth he had left behind. But what they didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the will he had left behind was just the beginning. The real secret lay in the family's past, buried beneath layers of old memories and forgotten promises. A promise he had made long ago, one that none of them would understand until it was too late. Days turned into weeks. The tension inside the house only grew, festering like an open wound. Mark had begun to search every corner of the house, rummaging through drawers, cabinets, and boxes in search of anything that could lead him to the missing will. But with each passing day, his frustration grew. The old man had always been meticulous, and Mark couldn't help but feel the weight of his father's calculated silence bearing down on him. Clara had withdrawn into herself, spending hours pacing around the house, trying to make sense of everything. She had contacted the lawyer who had handled their father's affairs in the past, but when she spoke to him, she found herself more confused than ever. The lawyer seemed distant, detached, almost as if he was hiding something. "There's nothing new to report," the lawyer had told her over the phone. "Your father has left everything in order. There's no indication of any changes." "But what about the will?" Clara had pressed. "He mentioned a new will, something about the house, the money." The lawyer's voice had faltered for a moment. "I'm afraid I can't discuss any details with you at this time, Clara. You'll have to wait until the proper time comes." It was as if they were all being kept in the dark, trapped in a game they didn't understand. Meanwhile, the old man remained untouched by their frantic search. He continued with his quiet routine, walking around the house, tending to his garden, and spending long hours in the same chair by the window. His mind was clear, and he felt a deep satisfaction in knowing that his children would soon be forced to confront the consequences of their actions. But there was still something missing. Something important. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the horizon, casting a warm orange glow across the sky, the old man sat at his window, staring out into the fading light. His thoughts wandered, drifting between memories of the past and the present. He had raised his children with love, or at least, that was what he had thought at the time. They had been his world, his reason for living. But somewhere along the way, they had changed. He had always known that their love for him was conditional, that it had always been about what he could provide for them, rather than who he was. He had accepted that. But the letter, the will, had been his final attempt to force them to see the truth. He wasn't just giving them nothing. He was showing them what they had become. And he was hoping that the pain of losing everything would finally make them understand. Back inside the house, Mark had reached his breaking point. He couldn't take it anymore. The silence. The uncertainty. The constant feeling that they were missing something crucial. "I'm going to the lawyer," he declared one afternoon, slamming his fist on the table. "I'll make him talk. If I have to break down his door, I will." Clara looked up from where she was sitting, her expression empty. "You really think that's going to help? You can't force someone to tell you what they don't want to." "I'm not asking," Mark said, his voice cold. "I'm taking control of this, Clara. You can keep waiting around, or you can help me." Clara didn't respond. She didn't know if she had the strength to go on with this anymore. But she wasn't going to stop him either. She had already lost her sense of purpose. And so, Mark left. He had to find the truth, even if it meant crossing lines he never thought he would. As he drove through the streets, his mind raced. His father had been playing a game, yes, but the question was, what was the prize? What did they stand to gain, and what were they about to lose? He didn't know the answers yet, but he was determined to find them. The night fell, and the old man remained at his window, watching as the world outside darkened. The house was quiet, save for the occasional creak of the floorboards. He knew that tomorrow, the next chapter would begin, their confrontation would come. But for now, he felt a strange peace. The storm was coming, but it wasn't yet here. And as the darkness deepened around him, he couldn't help but smile, knowing that they would soon understand the real meaning of his silence. It was 2 days before Mark returned. He had driven to the lawyer's office, a place he had visited so many times with his father over the years, each time carrying the weight of legal matters and property arrangements. But never once had he imagined that a visit to this same office would shake him to his core. He had pushed the lawyer for answers, more forcefully than he had ever been before. The lawyer had remained tight-lipped at first, shaking his head, telling him it was not the right time, that everything was in order and there was nothing to worry about. But Mark's determination, the anger simmering just beneath the surface, had cracked through that professional detachment. It was late in the afternoon when Mark finally got what he wanted. The lawyer relented and handed him an old, dusty box. The lawyer had warned him that what was inside wasn't meant for him, but Mark had ignored the warning. He felt a strange mix of anxiety and excitement. Inside that box, there was something he believed would answer all the questions, something that would explain his father's cryptic behavior. The box itself was small, but heavy. It was made of dark wood, stained with age, and the metal clasp that held it shut was rusted with time. As Mark opened the box, he was greeted by a stack of old papers, but one stood out. It was an envelope, neatly sealed, with the same handwriting he had seen on the letter his father had left. His father's handwriting was unmistakable, jagged and deliberate, as if each word was written with careful precision. Mark's heart skipped a beat. He knew that what was inside this envelope would change everything. That evening, as Mark returned home, the tension in the house was thick enough to cut with a knife. Clara sat in the kitchen, staring blankly at the table. She hadn't left her spot in hours. Her phone was off, the only light coming from the dim kitchen light above her head. "Clara," Mark's voice was rough, weary from the drive, his eyes hollow as he placed the box on the counter. "I found something." Clara didn't look up. "What's the point?" she asked, her voice flat. What could possibly be more important than what's already happened? Mark's frustration was palpable. "We don't know the whole story, Clara. We're just scratching the surface." He opened the box, revealing the envelope, and for the first time in a long while, Clara's gaze lifted. She blinked, her interest piqued. But still, she said nothing. Mark tore open the envelope. The letter inside was short but unmistakably clear. His father's words, carefully written, just like the one from before, sent a cold shiver down Mark's spine. "To my beloved children," the letter began. "What you are about to learn will test you, break you, and force you to face truths you are not ready for. I have no doubt you will try to claim what is rightfully mine, but understand this: what I give you now is not a gift. It is a burden. A gift, when given from the heart, is a joy. But this will bring you nothing but regret." Mark swallowed hard, his hands trembling. What does this mean?" Clara was standing now, slowly walking towards him, her expression one of concern and disbelief. Is this another will?" "Not exactly," Mark replied, still scanning the letter. "It's something else. Something more. As they continued reading, the letter detailed a hidden family secret, one that neither Mark nor Clara had ever suspected. The old man had buried something much deeper than material wealth. What their father had kept from them was a truth that tied their family to a past they had never known, a secret rooted in betrayal, love, and loss. The letter went on. The will, as you know it, does not contain what you think. The real inheritance is hidden. To claim it, you must follow the path I've set out for you. It will not be easy. It will be fraught with dangers, emotional, physical, and spiritual. But the choice is yours. Do you have the courage to confront what has been left to you? To face the shadows of the past and unearth what should have remained buried? Only then will you understand the true meaning of this inheritance. Mark's mind raced. He could hardly believe what he was reading. The words were both cryptic and chilling. What did their father mean by the shadows of the past? And why had he kept this secret for so long? The next morning, Clara and Mark stood at the foot of the stairs, the house eerily quiet. The letter had been tucked away in Mark's jacket, the mystery still hanging over them. There was no more waiting. The time had come to search, to dig deeper than they ever had before. We need to go through the old man's things, Clara said, her voice determined, though there was fear in her eyes. Maybe he left something, anything, that can explain all of this. Mark nodded. It's the only way. We can't afford to miss anything. They moved through the house, a place that had once been filled with their laughter, their arguments, their memories. Now, it felt like a mausoleum, the walls echoing with the weight of the past. They entered the study, the room where their father had spent most of his time over the years. Dust settled on the bookshelves, and papers were scattered haphazardly across the desk. It had been years since anyone had bothered to clean, but it was more than that. It was as if the room itself was holding on to memories that refused to be forgotten. Clara began to sift through the piles of papers, the sound of rustling filling the silence between them. Mark stood frozen by the desk, staring at the photograph that lay on the edge of the wooden surface. It was an old black-and-white photo, yellowed with age. In the picture, a young man stood alongside a woman, both of them smiling. But it wasn't just any picture. Mark's pulse quickened as he recognized the faces. The man was his father, but the woman. She was someone he had never seen before. This is her, Mark muttered, his voice barely audible. Clara turned, her brow furrowing. Who? Her, Mark said again, his voice shaking with realization. This woman. She's not anyone I recognize. But why would he have a picture of her here? Clara took the photo from his hands, examining it closely. We need to find out who she is. This could be a clue. If she's tied to the inheritance somehow. Mark didn't respond. His mind was already spinning, trying to make sense of it all. What had their father kept hidden? And why had he never told them about this woman? The days that followed were a blur. Mark and Clara continued to search every corner of the house, leaving no stone unturned. They found more photographs, more old letters, and faded documents, but nothing that connected the dots in a way they could understand. The mystery of the woman remained unsolved, and their father's silence seemed to grow heavier with each passing hour. Then, on the fourth night after the letter, they found something else, a box, hidden beneath the floorboards of the study, locked tight with a rusted padlock. Mark and Clara exchanged a glance. This was it. They had found the key to everything. With trembling hands, Mark pried the lock open, and inside, he found a set of journals, his father's journals. There were dozens of them, dating back decades, each one filled with the kind of intimate detail only a father could write about his children. But it wasn't just about them. The journals revealed the history of a love affair, a secret relationship with a woman Mark had never heard of. She was someone who had been a part of their father's life long before they had come into the picture. And, as it turned out, she was the woman in the photograph. But the deeper they read, the more unsettling the truth became. The woman wasn't just someone their father had loved, she was someone he had been forced to leave behind, someone whose memory had haunted him for years. The last journal entry was dated just a year before the old man's death. In it, he wrote about a final decision he had made, one that would affect everything. "I will leave this all behind," the journal read. "But I will not leave her memory behind. My children will never understand, but perhaps, one day, they will see what I have done." Mark and Clara stared at the words, their hearts heavy with the realization that their father's life had been much more complicated than they had ever imagined. The inheritance was no longer just about money or property, it was about something much deeper, something their father had carried with him all his life. And as they sat there, surrounded by the journals, the photographs, and the hidden truths, they realized that their quest for answers was only just beginning. The following days passed in a haze of uncertainty, the air thick with the weight of the truth they had begun to unravel. Mark and Clara, both physically and emotionally exhausted, were still reeling from the discoveries they had made in the journals. It was one thing to read about their father's secret life. It was another to realize that everything they had believed about him was a carefully constructed illusion. The father they thought they knew was nothing more than a man hidden behind a web of lies, fears, and untold stories. It had been over a week since they had uncovered the journals, and yet, they hadn't shared their findings with anyone. Every conversation with friends or acquaintances felt hollow, as if they were living in a parallel universe where their father's secrets loomed over them like an ever-present shadow. Even the small moments of normalcy, like eating dinner or watching television, felt surreal. How could they carry on with their lives when the very foundation of everything they had known was shifting beneath their feet? It was Clara who first suggested they go back to the house where their father had lived in his final years. They hadn't been back there since his death, and though Mark had been resistant, something inside him told him it was necessary. The house held the last pieces of the puzzle, the parts that would make everything finally make sense. The drive was long, stretching over winding roads, passing old fields that seemed to blur together in Mark's mind. The sky was overcast, as if the world was aware of the tension hanging over them. It had been a cold morning when they left, and the chill in the air had settled into their bones. Neither of them spoke much during the ride, lost in their own thoughts. Every now and then, Clara would glance over at Mark, as if seeking answers, but his face remained tight with the unspoken weight of their discoveries. When they finally reached the house, it felt like stepping into a time capsule. The building was just as it had been when they left it, almost eerily preserved. The ivy had crept up the side of the house, wrapping itself around the porch, and the front door was slightly ajar, as though inviting them in. It was a house frozen in time, but with an underlying sense of decay. It felt wrong, as though the house itself had been waiting for them to return, to continue the story that had begun so long ago. "Do you remember this place?" Clara asked softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Mark didn't answer immediately. His eyes scanned the house, his mind wandering back to the years when it had been a place of family. He remembered holidays, birthdays, laughter echoing through the walls. But now, it was all distant, like the memory of a life that no longer belonged to him. "Let's go inside," he said finally, his voice heavy with the weight of the moment. They stepped into the foyer, and a wave of nostalgia hit them both. It smelled of old wood and dust, a scent that brought back forgotten memories. Clara walked toward the living room, her footsteps soft against the creaking floorboards. Mark followed her, feeling a strange sense of foreboding. Everything was still here. Every piece of furniture, every knick-knack, as if their father had just stepped out for a walk. But there was no life here now. The house felt cold and empty, a shell of what it had once been. Mark wandered over to the fireplace, running his fingers along the mantel, dusting away years of neglect. He glanced at the photos on the wall, family portraits that once held such meaning for him now seemed like faded relics of a past that no longer existed. But one photo caught his eye, and his breath caught in his throat. It was a picture of their father, younger and smiling, standing next to the woman from the photograph they had found in the journals. She was the same woman from the old black and white photo, the one with the soft eyes and the mysterious smile. But now, in this picture, they were standing side by side, looking as if they had just returned from a trip. The look of affection between them was undeniable. The warmth of the image made Mark's heart race, but it was also laced with an overwhelming sense of guilt. His father had hidden her from them all these years. "Clara, come here," Mark called out softly. She approached, her face pale as she gazed at the photograph. "Who is she?" Clara asked, the question hanging between them like a cloud. Mark's voice was barely a whisper as he replied, "This is her. The woman he was in love with." Clara's face twisted in confusion. "But why didn't he ever tell us about her? About his life, his real life?" Mark didn't have an answer. The more they uncovered, the more questions arose. It was as if their father had lived an entirely separate existence, one that they had never been a part of, one that had been hidden behind a wall of silence and secrecy. And now, that wall had been shattered, leaving them with nothing but the fragments of a life they didn't know. "We need to keep looking," Mark said, breaking the silence that had settled between them. "There has to be more." Clara nodded, though her face betrayed her unease. She had a sinking feeling that this journey, this search for answers, was only going to make things worse. She wasn't sure if she was ready to know what other secrets lay buried in this house. They spent hours combing through the house, each room revealing new layers of their father's past. But it wasn't until they reached the attic that things took a darker turn. The attic was a small, cramped space filled with old trunks, boxes, and forgotten memories. The air was thick with dust, and the dim light from the single bulb overhead did little to illuminate the space. As they sifted through the boxes, Clara found something strange, a locked chest, different from anything else they had encountered. The chest was made of dark wood, its surface worn from years of neglect. It had a small, intricate keyhole, and though it was clearly old, it had been kept in pristine condition. Mark felt a surge of adrenaline. This was it. The chest had to hold the answers they were seeking. He had no idea what might be inside, but he felt in his gut that whatever it was, it would be the final piece to the puzzle. They searched the attic for a key, and after what felt like hours, Clara found it, hidden in a drawer beneath some old family albums. The key was small, delicate, and old-fashioned, but it fit perfectly into the lock of the chest. With a deep breath, Mark turned the key and opened it. Inside, there was more than just papers or mementos. The chest contained a series of letters, bound together with a faded ribbon. The first letter was addressed to Mark and Clara, written in their father's familiar handwriting. "My dear children," the letter began, "I know this will be hard for you to understand, but I cannot leave this world without giving you the truth. I have lived a life full of mistakes, regrets, and choices that will haunt me forever. The woman you have seen in the photographs was not just a fleeting romance. She was my true love, the woman I should have married. But fate intervened, and I was forced to choose a different path." Mark's heart raced as he continued to read. "I made a promise to her that I would never break. I promised that I would protect the legacy of our love, even if it meant keeping it hidden from you. The inheritance I have left behind is not just about money. It is a legacy of love, of loss, and of the choices I made that brought us to this point. I hope, in time, you will come to understand why I did what I did." Clara's eyes welled with tears as she finished reading. It was a confession, a story of love and heartbreak, and it shattered everything they had ever believed about their father. Mark felt a lump form in his throat as he processed the words. This is why he did it. He didn't want us to know. He didn't want us to see the life he had left behind. Clara wiped away a tear. But why? Why didn't he trust us enough to tell us the truth? Mark's hands shook as he set the letter down. Maybe he thought we wouldn't understand. Maybe he didn't think we were ready. But whatever the reason, we're the ones who have to deal with it now. The house, once a place of childhood memories, now felt like a tomb. Their father's secret life had turned everything upside down, and they were left to pick up the pieces. But they were no longer just searching for money or property. They were searching for the truth about their father, about themselves, and about the legacy he had left behind. The road ahead was uncertain, and as Mark and Clara sat in the silence of the attic, they realized that the legacy their father had left them was far more complicated than they had ever imagined. The truth was messy, painful, and filled with regret, but it was theirs to carry now. They couldn't turn away from it. The question remained, what would they do with it? As the sun began to set outside, casting long shadows through the attic window, they both understood that their journey was far from over. The journey they had begun had taken them further than either Mark or Clara had ever expected. What had started as a quest for a few answers had become something much more, a confrontation with the ghosts of their father's past, with the truth that neither of them had been prepared to face. They had unearthed secrets, uncovered family histories they never knew existed, and uncovered the legacy that their father had left behind, a legacy full of love, guilt, loss, and regret. The house where their father had spent his final years had once felt like a home, a place where they could always return to. Now, it felt like a mausoleum, a silent witness to the lives of those who had once lived within it. The attic, filled with dust and secrets, seemed to hold the final pieces of the puzzle. But the weight of those pieces, the burden of what they had learned, had not brought the clarity they sought. Instead, it had brought confusion, anger, and a deep sense of betrayal. Mark sat in the dim light of the attic, the letter from his father still resting on the dusty floor beside him. He couldn't stop thinking about the words that had been written there. The inheritance I have left behind is not just about money. It is a legacy of love, of loss, and of the choices I made that brought us to this point. Those words haunted him, each syllable pulling him deeper into a past he couldn't escape. The silence between Mark and Clara was thick, filled with the weight of unspoken thoughts. They hadn't discussed what they had found yet. It wasn't that they didn't want to. It was just that they didn't know how to. How could they talk about a man they had known as their father when they had just learned that he had been living a life entirely different from the one they had believed? Clara was the first to break the silence. She stood by the attic window, staring out at the gray sky, her arms crossed tightly around her chest. I don't understand it, Mark. Why would he keep this from us? Why didn't he tell us the truth? We were his children. We should have known. Mark glanced at the letter again, as if it held the answers. I don't know. Maybe he thought we wouldn't understand. Maybe he thought the truth would tear us apart. But we're already torn apart, Clara replied bitterly. This is too much, Mark. It's all too much. Mark didn't respond immediately. He could feel the weight of her words. His mind was still processing everything, the photographs, the journals, the letter. Their father had built his life around secrets, and now those secrets were threatening to destroy everything he had left behind. Finally, Mark stood up, shaking his head as he walked toward the old trunk. We can't just sit here, Clara. We need to find out everything. We need to know what he was hiding, who he was really protecting. Clara didn't move. She remained at the window, her eyes distant. What if it's not something we can fix? What if it's too late for that? It's never too late, Mark said, though there was a part of him that wasn't so sure anymore. The uncertainty that had been swirling around them seemed to be getting heavier with every passing minute. But one thing was clear, there were more questions than answers, and they would never be able to find peace until they had uncovered every last bit of the truth. It took them another hour to comb through the remaining contents of the chest. As they carefully examined each document, they found more letters, all written by their father to the mysterious woman from the photographs. The letters spoke of love, regret, and longing, a love that had never been fully realized, a love that had been forced into the shadows by a choice their father had made long ago. But there was one letter, more recent than the rest, that caught Mark's attention. It was dated just a few months before his father's death. The words were different this time, more desperate, more final. "I don't know how much longer I have left," the letter began. "I've made peace with the fact that I will never see her again, that the life we could have had will never be. But my children, they deserve to know the truth. I'm sorry for not being honest with you, for hiding the things I've hidden. I've always loved you, but I've also carried this guilt for so long that it's become a part of who I am. I never wanted you to feel this burden, but now, I see that you must. I hope that in time, you will understand." Mark read the letter in silence, his hands trembling. The weight of it hit him hard. This wasn't just a confession, it was a final plea for forgiveness. Their father had known he was running out of time, and he had chosen to leave them with this final, painful truth. Clara moved closer, peering over Mark's shoulder as he continued to read. "What does it mean, Mark? What is he trying to tell us?" Mark's voice was barely above a whisper. "I think he's trying to tell us that we have to carry this burden now. We have to know the truth, even if it destroys us." Clara's face twisted with emotion. "But what are we supposed to do with it? We can't just forget about everything we've learned. This changes everything." Mark didn't know how to answer her. How could he? They had spent their whole lives thinking they knew who their father was, and now that image was shattered. The man they had admired, the man they had called their father, was someone completely different, a man who had hidden his heart, his guilt, and his past from them all these years. They couldn't undo what had been done. The secrets had already been exposed. And now, there was no going back. The next morning, Mark and Clara set out to find more answers. The house, which had once been filled with the comforting hum of family life, now felt like a prison, a place they were trapped in, unable to escape until they had found every last piece of the puzzle. The weight of their father's secret life hung over them like a storm cloud, and they knew they couldn't leave until they had uncovered it all. They headed to the town library, the place where their father had spent countless hours during his younger years, researching old family records and genealogy. They weren't sure what they would find there, but it felt like the next logical step. If their father had kept so much hidden from them, maybe the library held the key to unraveling it all. The library was small but old, its walls lined with dusty bookshelves that stretched to the high ceiling. The librarian, an elderly woman with silver hair, greeted them with a polite smile. "Can I help you?" she asked. Mark glanced at Clara before speaking. "We're looking for information on our family. My father, he used to come here a lot." The librarian nodded slowly, her expression changing slightly. "Ah, yes. He was quite the regular. Always asking about the family history. I think he left something behind, something important. Let me see what I can find." Mark and Clara exchanged a glance as the librarian disappeared into the back room. Neither of them knew what to expect, but the hope that had flickered inside them earlier was beginning to dim. How much more could they take? What would they learn next? And would it change them even more than it already had? The librarian returned a few minutes later, holding a large folder in her hands. She set it down on the counter and smiled softly. "Here you go. These are the records your father was most interested in. It's all about your family history." Mark and Clara took the folder, their hands shaking as they flipped through the documents. At first, it seemed like just a collection of genealogical records, listing names, dates, and places. But then, Clara stopped on a page that made her blood run cold. There, in black and white, was a birth certificate. It wasn't their father's name that caught her eye, it was the name of the mother listed there, a woman they had never heard of. The woman wasn't their grandmother or great-grandmother. She was someone else entirely. A name they didn't recognize. Mark looked over her shoulder, his heart pounding. "Who is that? Why is this on here?" Clara's voice trembled as she read aloud. This can't be right. It says, it says our father had another family before us. The discovery shook them both to their core. Their father, the man they had believed was a loving husband and father, had been living a double life. And now, it seemed, they were the ones left to carry the weight of the truth. The library, once a place of curiosity, had now become the arena where the last of their father's secrets would be uncovered. The room felt heavy with the weight of what they had just learned. Clara's fingers trembled as she held the birth certificate, the name on it scrawled in cold ink that seemed to mock them from the page. Mark could feel the room spinning, his mind struggling to piece together the fragments of the life their father had led. A second family? Had he really kept this from them? Had their entire childhood been built on a foundation of lies? It was all too much. The pain of betrayal, the realization that they had never truly known their father, was more than either of them could bear. But they couldn't stop now. There was more to uncover. The birth certificate was just the beginning of a web that they needed to untangle. They couldn't leave without knowing the whole truth. What had happened to this second family? And why had their father hidden it all? Clara, her voice barely a whisper, spoke first. We need to find out who she was. This woman, she was important to him. I don't care how long it takes, Mark. I need to know. Mark nodded, his throat tight. The fire that had ignited in him during their journey to uncover the truth had now turned into something more, a need for understanding, for closure. His mind raced as he thought back to the letters, the love his father had written, the guilt he had carried. This woman, this family. They were the missing pieces. They had to be. The librarian, who had been watching them closely, sensed the gravity of their discovery. Is there something I can help you with? She asked gently, her voice full of quiet understanding. Mark's eyes flickered to Clara. They hadn't spoken about what to do next, but the answer was clear in their minds. We need to know more, Mark said. About our father's first family. About this woman. Can you help us find any records about her? The librarian paused, her expression thoughtful. She seemed to know more than she was letting on. After a long silence, she walked back to the back room again, this time moving with purpose. Clara's heart raced in her chest. Every moment felt like it was dragging them closer to a conclusion they weren't sure they were ready for. When the librarian returned, she held a thin manila envelope. I thought you might be looking for this, she said, placing it on the counter. Your father came in here many times, but not just for family records. He wanted to know about this woman. About her history. You might find something here that will help. Mark took the envelope with a hand that shook slightly. Thank you, he said, the words feeling small and inadequate for the storm of emotions inside him. As he opened the envelope, he found several documents, each one more shocking than the last. There was a marriage certificate, dated years before their father had married their mother. And there, in bold letters, was the woman's name, the same one from the birth certificate. Her name was Clara Hamilton. But it wasn't just the name that shook Mark to his core. There was another document, a death certificate. Clara Hamilton had died tragically young, just a few years after the marriage. She had died in a car accident, her life cut short, leaving behind a child, a son, who had been raised by another family member. Mark's heart pounded. His eyes flicked back to Clara, who was standing behind him, reading over his shoulder. She looked pale, almost ghostly. Mom. Clara's voice was choked, and Mark could see the confusion and pain mirrored in her eyes. This is insane, Mark muttered under his breath. He never told us. He never told us that we had a brother. Clara recoiled as if struck. A brother? You mean, we have another sibling? The reality of the situation hit her like a physical blow. Why didn't he ever tell us? Mark shook his head in disbelief. He had no answers. He only had more questions. The documents in the envelope seemed to be endless, each one revealing more fragments of a life that had been hidden away. The last document was a letter, written by their father, not long before he died. "To my children," the letter began. "If you are reading this, then you have discovered the truth. I have lived a life that I cannot change, and I have carried the burden of secrets for far too long. I had a family before you, a family that I loved deeply. But fate is cruel, and life does not always go as planned. Clara Hamilton was my first love, the woman I married. We had a son, your half-brother. But she was taken from us too soon. It was a pain I could never overcome. I married your mother in the hope of creating a new life, a life where I could make things right. I never intended for you to find out about him. I never wanted to hurt you." Mark stopped reading, his hands trembling as he set the letter down. This changes everything." Clara was silent, staring at the documents with wide, unblinking eyes. For a moment, neither of them knew what to say. The weight of their father's secrets was suffocating, and they both felt like they were drowning in them. The ride home from the library was a quiet one. The air between them was thick with unspoken thoughts. Mark's mind was a whirlwind of emotions, confusion, anger, betrayal, and a deep sadness. Clara, on the other hand, was lost in thought, her eyes fixed on the passing scenery as if it might offer some kind of escape from the storm inside her. "What do we do now?" Clara finally asked, breaking the silence. Her voice was quiet, tinged with an emotion Mark couldn't quite place. "I don't know," Mark replied, his tone filled with uncertainty. "I don't even know if I can process all of this. A brother? A whole life we knew nothing about?" Clara nodded slowly. "It feels like everything we knew about him, everything we thought we knew, was a lie." "I don't think it was a lie," Mark said slowly, his voice quieter now. "I think he just didn't know how to tell us. Maybe he didn't want us to hate him. Maybe he thought we'd never forgive him. And maybe he was right." Clara didn't answer. She didn't know what to say. She didn't know if forgiveness was even possible. But one thing was certain, this journey had shattered everything they thought they knew about their father. The man they had once seen as a hero had been a deeply flawed human being. Struggling with his own demons, carrying burdens he never shared. As they pulled into the driveway of their family home, the house that had once been a place of warmth and love now seemed cold and foreign. The legacy of their father felt like a weight on their shoulders, and they weren't sure how to carry it. The next few days passed in a blur. Clara spent most of her time alone in her room, sifting through the papers they had found, trying to piece together a timeline of events. Mark, on the other hand, found himself standing at the edge of a precipice. The weight of the secret had become almost unbearable, and he wasn't sure how much longer he could carry it. But eventually, the time came to take the final step. Mark and Clara knew that they couldn't keep living in the shadows of their father's past. They had to face it, no matter how painful it might be. It was time to meet their brother. They had learned his name from the records, Andrew Hamilton. Their half-brother. The child of their father's first marriage, the son of the woman who had died too soon. Mark and Clara didn't know where to begin, but they knew they had to try. The journey to find Andrew would be their final chapter in uncovering the truth. Days later, after a series of phone calls and visits to various places, Mark and Clara finally found him. Andrew Hamilton lived in a small town about 3 hours away, in a modest apartment on the outskirts of town. When they arrived, the man they found standing at the door looked almost nothing like their father, but his eyes, those familiar eyes, held the same haunted look that Mark and Clara knew all too well. Andrew's face softened when he saw them standing there. "I've been waiting for this day," he said, his voice low and steady. "I knew, eventually, you'd come." And with that, the story of their father's hidden family finally came full circle. Mark and Clara, standing before the brother they never knew they had, understood that while the past was painful, it was also a part of who they were. And in that moment, they realized that the legacy their father had left behind was not just one of secrets, but of family, of shared pain, love, and the hope that, despite everything, they could still find a way to move forward.